All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Tori Yu from the LBJ School, and I'm joined by researchers from the University of Texas at Austin today for a roundtable and Q&A on some new research published today in energy policy. This research, which already has gained a lot of interest, suggests a federal tax credit called the 45Q could incentivize and accelerate the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Today's experts are the study's authors, UT's Andrew Waxman, Sheila Olmstead, and Ben Leibowicz. I will drop these names with links to bios in the chat shortly. I'm going to turn it over to them as well pretty shortly, but first let me cover housekeeping and set the stage. Please jump in at any point during the roundtable. This is an informal conversation and researchers are here to help answer your questions. You're welcome to raise your hand, but again, we encourage you to jump in. Please note this meeting is also being recorded. For some background, over the last few months, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, has been having a moment. Elon Musk, Exxon, Greg Abbott, and Joe Biden have made news talking about the subject or implementing policy to make it happen. Climate models and analysis by groups like the International Energy Agency show that it will be harder and more expensive to meet climate goals without CCUS. Not only that, researchers published last year shows that industrial emissions on the US Gulf Coast are projected to increase by about 540 million metric tons if everything that is projected to get built is built. To put that in context, that is about 30% of total US greenhouse gas emissions. So in a world where the science tells us we must reduce emissions by 30% in 2030, our emissions will go up by about that much if this boom happens or happens without emission reductions. CCUS can play a role in reducing these emissions, particularly in Texas. Texas is at the top of the list of places globally that have the infrastructure, technical know-how, and natural resources to implement CCUS projects. In fact, according to data from the Global CCUS Institute, Texas already has about 1/3 of global CCUS projects. But to have the scale necessary to combat the climate crisis, the number of projects has to increase significantly. And we are seeing signs that may be happening. In April, Exxon announced plans to explore a CCUS hub in the Houston area. In May, UT researchers published a paper outlining how Texas can serve as a carbon capture hub. In June, Governor Abbott signed legislation that many observers expect to streamline permitting for CCUS in Texas. And in late June, bipartisan legislation called the Catch Act was introduced into the US Senate that, among other things, expands the federal tax credit available for sequestering carbon. The common thread in all of these efforts is the need for collective action in order to bring down the high cost of CCUS projects, whether through increased tax credits, improved permitting, cost sharing, or infrastructure planning. That's where this paper comes in. The paper's authors find that a current federal tax credit could be critical to helping the US reach end of decade carbon neutrality targets while yielding economic benefits, particularly on the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast. So Dr. Andrew Waxman, let's jump right in. I'm going to ask you first to summarize key findings for us.
Thanks, Tori. In our work that was published today in energy policy, we present evidence that a federal tax credit that Tori just mentioned, the 45Q credit, could help increase the benefits and economic benefits to firms in particular, and then the development of carbon capture, utilization, and storage infrastructure. Because it compensates firms for investments in the infrastructure that are used to capture, transport, and store carbon dioxide emissions, the major greenhouse gas that humans produce. Participating firms could save as much as $60 million per year. This process, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, is a process that reduces the amount of carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere. It does so by capturing and storing emissions underground in deep wells, or by using them for some form of industrial production, such as green cement. Analysis of President Biden's climate plan suggests that the US will need to dramatically ramp up this kind of technology in order to meet end-of-decade carbon neutrality goals that have been set. That said, deployment has been slow. It is technically feasible, and as we show in this paper, there's a case to be made that it's economically feasible to reduce emissions from carbon capture and storage through industrial sources. It's also possible to do it for electricity generation. And if we think about the larger set of policies that are part of the Biden plan, transitioning to renewables and electric vehicles, Industrial processes, which again are the focus of our study, they require large amounts of energy. And so it would take decades before non-fossil fuel energy sources become viable. So if we want to reduce the emissions from these sources, essentially we either have to stop production or CCUS is the most immediate alternative option. In this paper, we being myself, Ben Leibowicz, Sheila Olmstead, who are both on this call, and two students, estimate the cost of using CCUS to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from current and planned industrial facilities exclusively in the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast. These are primarily large industrial facilities engaged in activities like oil refining, natural gas production, storage and export, and petrochemical production. At the high end of our estimates, capturing carbon dioxide from a set of new and planned facilities could produce economic benefits of up to $4.6 billion per year. And that comes directly from the avoided climate damages from capturing CO2 and putting it underground. Current benefits from those stored CO2 exceed the outlays for the 45Q credit, that is to say what the government would pay firms, which are estimated to be about 3.9 billion. Industrial sources emitted are about 22% of US greenhouse gases as of 2018, and the trend for that for the industrial sector continues upward, unlike, say, electricity generation or even transportation. Prior studies have demonstrated a dramatic growth in expected industrial emissions, such as the paper that Tori just mentioned, highlighting the 541 million tons of CO2 per year that could happen if new facilities on the Gulf are built. The International Energy Agency models of climate change and climate policy have shown that to meet mid-century carbon neutrality goals, CCUS will need to provide at least 9% of cumulative emission reductions, but fewer than 20 large-scale facilities were operating as of 2019. So Louisiana and Texas are specifically well positioned to examine the cost effectiveness of carbon capture and storage for three reasons. First, the northwest area of the Gulf Coast is broadly suitable for on and offshore geologic sequestration, that is to say, putting the CO2 underground offshore, and has existing large-scale CCUS facilities already. Second, the region has a large and growing collection of industrial activity where CCUS potential exists. Again, this is not specifically electricity generation. This is things like refining, petrochemicals, and liquefied natural gas export facilities. And lastly, the tax credits for 45Q are scheduled to ramp up significantly between now and 2030. Indeed, as Tori mentioned earlier, the Catch Act and other proposals to Congress are set to potentially increase these further. And majors like ExxonMobil and Chevron have made key investments in the region. So this could provide a bipartisan solution to get early gains in carbon reduction as it potentially slows climate change and provides an opportunity to keep and even grow jobs from an important economic sector in the region and the economy as a whole. That said, I just want to point out that CCUS is certainly controversial, and this study is not meant to be an endorsement for CCUS, but it is meant to understand what the economic incentives at the moment are given current federal policy. I'll stop there and hand it back to Tori.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really helpful. I want to asking you a question. Your demonstrates economically feasible for a large swath of the Gulf. Can you elaborate, though, on why this has not yet happened, if it is both technologically and economically feasible?
Thanks, Tori. Yeah. So so just to reiterate what you just said, in the study, we elaborate on how the technology is there and the economics are in place to make this potentially profitable to firms to develop. Obviously, the infrastructure takes a little bit of time to develop, but we've had this technology, available for close to 20 years at this point. So there are a host of regulatory and legal reasons, including the accessibility of Class 6 permits, which the recent bill that went through the Texas legislature in June meant to address, which make, the Texas bill makes it easier for firms to get permits to dig geological sequestration wells offshore. Also, just overall liability associated with the set of joint ventures. A key component of our analysis is the existence of hubs or clusters of facilities that would pipe CO2 jointly to some offshore location. Getting the legal and liability kind of institutions set up to make that happen remains challenging at the moment, given the structure of current federal policy. And so I know people are currently working on this as well.
Thank you, Dr. Waxman. I just want to remind folks that they can jump in at any time with questions. Your study focuses on emissions from 75 industrial facilities in the US Gulf Coast. Is there potential for CCUS to other industries and locations around the US?
Thanks. Yeah, so there is already some experience doing this beyond our facilities with electricity generation, particularly natural gas combustion. That's not the focus of our study, and there is, a set of other considerations taken into account there. In particular, the trade-off between, so quote unquote green natural gas, that is to say, using natural gas for electricity and then putting the emissions underground, as compared to ramping up renewables that could potentially offset that electricity generation. Within industrials themselves, there's certainly some work exploring doing this in other regions of the country or in sectors beyond the ones that I've just mentioned, such as cement or metals. Doing it at scale, in particular, that takes advantage of sort of this hub or cluster setup of facilities in a common region becomes a little bit more difficult as we look outside of the Texas Gulf region. And so the set of kind of cost-saving incentives that we lay out in the paper become a little bit harder to find in those other settings.
Thank you. Your study focuses on the role of industrial clusters, including in the title on the role of clusters in enabling this technology to be more economically feasible.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'd kick this question to my co-author, Ben Leibowicz. He's going to be doing some follow-up work on this specifically as well. So give him a chance to answer.
Sure. So as you said, that was one question we were interested in the study, is what are the economic benefits of developing clusters of industrial facilities that are capturing CO2 that are close together geographically, so that you can transport CO2 more economically to storage locations via the pipeline network. So the idea is, if you had to individually connect each facility to the reservoir where the CO2 would be deposited, then you'd be building a lot of miles of CO2 pipelines. So our hypothesis that we looked at in the study was that if you take a cluster of closely located industrial facilities, build sort of short CO2 pipelines and aggregate CO2 from all of those facilities, and then transmit it via a single large pipeline to the storage site, you might be able to achieve economies of scale and lower the cost of this whole infrastructure system. So one very interesting finding that we found in our study is that whether there are big economic benefits to developing these facilities in these geographic clusters really depends on how much CO2 you plan to capture, or another way of thinking of it is how generous is the incentive to lead to more CO2 capture. So really the short version of the story is that if you have a relatively weaker incentive and you're capturing less CO2, then it actually makes more sense to just identify the facilities with the lowest CO2 capture costs and connect those individual facilities to the reservoirs where you're going to store the CO2. Whereas if you're going for a more ambitious policy with a stronger incentive and storing more total carbon dioxide, then there are big gains to this, this facility clustering approach. So we have that main figure in our paper, which shows how the supply curves, when you're looking at individual facilities versus this clustering approach, sort of cross each other, in that you get to a certain CO2 volume that you're storing overall, when the gains to the cluster approach more than offset trying to pick off the facilities with the lowest capture costs.
Thank you, Ben. I want to open it up to anyone else, any of the reporters here for questions to the researchers. Does anyone want to jump in with a question?
Hi guys, Irina Ivanova from CBS News. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. Thank you for doing this research. I want to ask a sort of big picture question. As you're all aware, there's a huge debate in the environmental community and generally about whether the best way to reduce emissions is to incentivize the reduction of emissions or whether to penalize people for emitting. So I wonder if that's something that you looked at either in this research or elsewhere in your work, and can you talk about from an economic perspective which of those approaches yields more effective results?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Sheila, would you feel comfortable fielding it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. No, it is a great question. So, I mean, as economists, our preferred instrument is always the carbon tax. But, you shouldn't quote me saying that because no one will read the paper, right? So, the challenge really for that has been political. And what we see instead is this set of, sort of very specific sectoral, policies coming out of the administration. And I think that harks back to the failure in 2010 to get a kind of comprehensive economy-wide carbon price, and maybe the lessons the administration learned from that process, and also the new political reality and the kind of narrow divide in the Senate and so on. So, I guess I'd say you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We already have a set of incentives for 45Q, and there are incentives for many different carbon reducing technologies within, kind of federal policy, not just tax policy, but as Andrew mentioned earlier, for electric vehicles and other, kinds of approaches. So it's not surprising that, that incentives are more politically feasible, right? Especially, with bipartisan support than our disincentives. I do think it's a really interesting question, and Andrew and I and Ben have a broader project on CCUS that's developing over the next several years to look at those kinds of trade-offs, right? If you price carbon versus using a CCUS incentive, obviously you might have very different implications for things like local and regional air pollutants, or you're going to hit different sectors, right? An economy-wide carbon price might give you a lot less CCUS than a CCUS incentive does, right? Because that's picking a specific technology. So there are a lot of different trade-offs. And I guess I would say we appreciate very much, right, the benefits of, of an economy-wide carbon tax that would hit industrial sector emissions just as you would others. The last thing I would say is that the most expensive, on average, right, if you think about kind of the cost effectiveness of reducing carbon dioxide emissions in different parts of the US economy, electricity sector fairly low, right? But, the kind of high hanging fruit tends to be in some of these industrial sources. And so the level of the carbon tax that you would need to incentivize, significant reductions might actually be quite high. And so, would we get, right now we have an incentive in 45Q that's going up toward what I think $50 per ton, right, in 2026. And if we have an even richer set of incentives as a result of some of the, the legislation being considered in the Congress, would we get a disincentives that's that high? So I think you have to think about those trade-offs, right? We kind of, work with what we've got. That might be a good approach for now. It certainly seems to be the approach the administration is taking and the one that the Congress is open to. But, then again, if we were to end up, years from now in a situation where we have an economy-wide carbon price, that would displace, right, some of the incentive that was created by 45Q.
Thank you, Dr. Olmstead. I have a question from Malcolm Ramsey. What logistics transports will emerge for the development of CCUS infrastructure, particularly demand for outsized project cargo?
So I'll take a stab at this, and maybe Ben Leibowicz can chime in because he's worked on some of these issues before. So I think this question is about the infrastructure construction itself, setting up the CCUS as opposed to transport of carbon as part of a CCUS project. We dug into sort of the costing of the projects themselves, but in terms of transport of outsized project cargo, I don't know that we know a ton about it as a team ourselves. There's another group at UT that really studies the technology of CCUS, I think from our perspective, in terms of transport and logistics, one thing that matters is sort of the pipeline network, pipelines continue to be controversial, and sort of somewhat challenging political topic, and obviously there's a lot of infrastructure involved in getting the right of ways set up as well, and also there are legal and logistical challenges in terms of reaching near shore storage locations, such as the one we model in this. Ben, is there anything I missed there?
Well, I'll sort of just riff off the general question about logistics and the infrastructure. So one important finding, I think, from our study, and this also confirms findings from previous research, is that most of the cost of CCUS overall is in the capture itself. So the pipeline network, at least according to our bottom-up engineering cost estimates, actually accounts for a relatively small, though non-negligible portion of the overall cost of capturing, transporting, and storing carbon dioxide from CCUS. However, as we show in our paper, because the incentive is actually set quite close to the cost, being able to economize a little bit on the transport costs and the pipeline network, even if it only accounts for something like 15% of the overall cost, it can actually make the difference between whether a particular facility is economical to exploit for capturing CO2 or not, given the current level of the incentive. It also creates some interesting planning challenges because, like Andrew was alluding to earlier, developing this full CCUS infrastructure will require coordination between many actors making different investments in different parts of the supply chain. So there's the facilities where CO2 is going to be captured, which may be owned and operated by a different company than whoever is investing in the pipelines themselves. And eventually the incentive will have to trickle down to the companies enough so that they're incentivized to make this investment in the pipeline network. And it could be another company entirely that's actually owns and operates the geologic storage site. So on the earlier question about some of the reasons why we may not see as much deployment as our bottom-up engineering cost estimates suggest, is that we think that there are coordination failures that need to be overcome in order to actually develop this infrastructure to a scale where it's then easier for subsequent projects to become justified.
Thank you, Dr. Leibowicz. I've got one more question in the chat right now, but I want to let folks know that you can jump in at any time with questions. Please feel free to raise your hand, go off mute, or put your question in the chat. We'll make sure we direct it to our researchers. The next question I have for you is, what policies can Texas, Louisiana, and the United States adopt to make CCUs happen more quickly?
Yeah, so there's a host of things, some of which we've talked about already. And Sheila Olmstead is actually going to be leading a project to develop this in a little bit more detail. So 45Q, which we study, is a production tax credit. So it's based upon the amount of CO2 produced. There are also investment tax credits, which could possibly be used to incentivize the actual infrastructure itself, although they're not on the books yet. As I mentioned before, there are several states, including Texas, North Dakota, and Wyoming, which have taken over jurisdiction for the set of permits that allow offshore and actually onshore wells for CO2 sequestration storage. There are also just a host of regulatory and liability questions about who manages the site, if there are questions about the security and the stability of the site as CO2 is being stored over time, who bears the liability, who's responsible for doing maintenance. And these are not unknown problems more broadly in the oil and gas industry in terms of thinking about retired well sites. So those are a few. Sheila, is there anything else you think that I missed?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, obviously the state and local stuff is going to vary on the ground quite a bit from place to place, but the federal stuff, one of the things that we note in the paper is that, this federal incentive has been there for a long time, but even, as we kind of wrote the paper and finalized the version that went to the journal, there was still a lot of uncertainty about, what specifically the rules were to get the credit, right? So the IRS, the Department of the Treasury, was very, very slow in getting out, sort of a set of rules to match the, the incentive that they had provided in the 45Q tax credit. And that's really important, right? The original credit sort of said the necessary construction start date was 2023, and you're talking about projects that are going to be going on for a long time. These are big, kind of major capital investments, and it's very hard for firms to respond to just that marginal incentive of the tax credit without some security over, whether the whole project is at risk of even qualifying for that. So one thing that the administration could think about doing would be, kind of whatever happens in the Congress, increasing the incentive could be quite effective. In fact, our paper shows that there's a pretty broad kind of flat region of these marginal cost curves that we estimate, in which a small increase in the tax credit could, on the margin, incentivize a lot more sequestration. But again, just doing that without taking care of these underlying questions about liability and how the rules apply and which projects are going to qualify is probably not going to do a whole lot, right? That might be one of the major reasons that we see, much less than one might predict just looking at that marginal incentive that we identify in the paper.
Thank you, Dr. Olmstead. Any final questions from any of our guests today for today's researchers? And is there anything that any of our researchers today would like to add before we close?
I'm sorry, could I just jump in here? It's Kevin Crowley here from Bloomberg. Just wanted to ask, when you're analyzing these incentives and that, do you look at them as on like kind of a cost basis, like as in how much the project would cost to get going, or do you build in a kind of like a profit incentive? Because I think some of these companies look at it like, okay, if I can just get my money back, what's the point of doing it? I need to actually see a return. And then kind of as a follow on from that, if these companies are able to make a profit out of it, is it kind of politically feasible for these sort of polluting industries to actually make a profit out of these sort of tax credits that are essentially related to kind of cleaning up their own mess?
Yeah, that's a great point. So basically, at any point at which, well, actually, let me back up. We're including the cost of capital, operations, and maintenance for all aspects, and Ben went into that in some detail in terms of the capture, the stuff, the machinery that goes into the plant and actually recovers carbon dioxide gas is the most expensive component. Operating the pipelines, some estimates about what the costs of access to right-of-ways of land to lay out pipelines, and the well development and maintenance and security and stability. So those are all things that go into the cost side. At any point at which the incentive per ton of carbon abated is above the kind of incremental or marginal cost of that infrastructure, then you're right. The firm is in a sense going to be returning a positive amount of money from that unit of carbon dioxide and pocketing that. This is not the only production credit associated with this industry, right? So oil and gas companies already get tax credits, and I'm not saying that to defend, but I'm just saying that there's a legal basis for that. Whether there's a climate strategy or moral basis, I'll hold off on commenting on. But as Sheila mentioned earlier, as economists, we have alternative perspectives on what our first choice for policy to deal with climate might be. And I think what we just wanted to understand with this paper is what are the economic incentive for firms. And you're right, in some cases, it means that they will not just be able to recover costs, but actually earn a return from the investment. So that's an important sort of feature to know.
Can I just jump in one other follow-up to that? I think Andrew did a great job answering that question. If you think about, so what we've estimated are these kind of incremental incentive, right? This, the incremental incentive provided by 45Q, which is X dollars per ton, right? And that's kind of a flat line. It's got steps to it because it's increasing over time. And then, the marginal cost is that incremental, right? Just what is that kind of cost of that last unit of sequestration? And that's what we're comparing. And that means that, right, because those costs increase, right? It's sort of an increasing function because those increase for everything except for that marginal unit. There is this potential for profit, right, from the from engaging in this activity. But I think one of the more interesting things about what we've done is that our cost curves are estimated for this whole set of different industries. So it's cheaper for some facilities than for others. It's cheaper for some sector, pieces of the industrial sector than for others. And so clearly there would be some, individual plant locations and industries that would be more likely to adopt the, under a certain set of incentives than others. And we can see that, even in our graphs that, the ones that are most likely to adopt are those ones with those, fairly low marginal costs. And then the ones with the higher marginal costs, right? Either because we've got some error in our estimates, right? Or because they're looking at, kind of something different on their ledger, they would be less likely to adopt. So, that just taking kind of what we've done with a grain of salt in that way is useful. And looking at the heterogeneous nature, right? This kind of highly variable nature of what it would mean from the perspective of any individual facility is important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah, and just
thanks.
one more thing on Kevin's question, which I think is a good one, is that our calculations assume that these facilities will continue to be able to take advantage of the 45Q incentive moving into the future. So again, just one more reason why we might not see as much deployment as our marginal cost curves would suggest is that there's policy risk in the future. So sort of along the lines of what Kevin was asking about, it could be that the return is just not so attractive to overcome the risk of investing upfront in this project. And like Andrew mentioned, we have sort of a broader project, which is just beginning. And one of the things we're going to look at there is other potential policies to stimulate CCS deployment, such as dedicating the incentives more to the upfront investment, which helps reduce risk, because then the project breaking even is not dependent on this sort of long run stream of revenues. But yeah, and just one last point, of course, when we calculate this levelized cost of CCUS, we're doing that at actually a pretty high interest rate that's sort of baked into the calculation. So that would assume that these companies are actually looking for an investment that's profitable relative to a reasonably high rate of return.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to all of our researchers today. I'm going to encourage folks to jump in if they've got any remaining questions while I go through our final housekeeping for the day. The press announcement went out earlier this morning. We will make sure that you get a copy of that announcement as well as a recording of this video after today's call. If there are no further questions for today's researchers, I want to thank everyone for their time this morning. Thank you to our researchers for joining us, and thank you to today's guests for your interest. If that's all, I'll close out. All right. Thanks, everyone.